And you can find those recordings and meeting notes and other information on the wiki. In addition to the wiki, we've got Twitter, it's pretty active, and YouTube that's getting more use. So check those resources out if you haven't already. And we should probably get intros out of the way before we forget to do it. And it's our custom to do it in the presenters, kind of the order of participants on the presenters screen. So that means, Bruno, you're up first, if you don't mind telling us a little bit about yourself, like why you're joining today, your name.
No, I can't. I'm too shy. And all the Italians are so shy, so I can't speak really. No, so I discovered OpenLineage and Marquez project a couple of months ago. They, given that I work in BI, I'm interested a lot by the OpenLineage principle. And given that essentially there is no product today, no commercial product that is really a good solution for tracing lineage. As I said, I come from the BI world, so I'm not into Airflows or Apache Spark world. I'm more in the database, standard database world and BI standard BI tool. So that's all for me. Up to the next.
Thank you. Next up is John.
Hi guys, I'm John. I work with Michael Robinson on the community team at Astronomer, working primarily with OpenLineage and Airflow, but also engaging with Marquez. So I'm here to help out how I can and engage in some discussions if I have anything to say.
Thank you. Next up is Willy.
Hello, everyone. I'm Willy. I am the project lead on Marquez and the co-creator. Yeah, I'm out in San Francisco, and I'm working on data observability at Astronomer.
Thank you. Next is Peter.
Hey, I'm Peter. I'm a software engineer at Astronomer, and I'm a contributor to Marquez.
Thanks. Next is Mike Collado.
Hey folks, Mike Collado. I'm a staff software engineer at Astronomer. I work on the observability team. I'm a contributor to OpenLineage and to Marquez.
Thanks. Next up is Minkyu.
Hi, I'm Minkyu, and I'm a software engineer at Astronomer, also working for our observability team, and I'm also contributor to Marquez and OpenLineage.
Thank you. Next is Benji.
Hey everyone, I'm Benji Lampel. Also work at Astronomer, and I'm product manager there on the OpenLineage side of things, and Marquez as well.
Okay. Thank you. Next is Julian.
Hello, I'm Julian. I'm the lead for the OpenLineage project and a longtime Marquez contributor. I'm wearing the t-shirt today.
Nice. Thank you. Very nice. Michael Robinson here. I coordinate these meetings, and I'm on the community team at Astronomer with John. Let's see, did I forget to call anyone's name? I'm looking through the list one more time just to be sure. I don't think so. On the agenda this month, we have a few announcements. It's an eventful couple weeks in the community, actually, recent release, and we'll hear about one of the changes in that release from Mike. Then we have 2 discussion topics, followed by open discussion. Let me quickly get into some announcements. As I said, we've got a lot going on. Actually, next week, a week from today, a few events happening. Julian will be speaking at Data Council Austin, be telling us about his history in open source and roles in various impactful projects, not limited to Marquez and OpenLineage. And he'll be holding open office hours, and then joining the OpenLineage meetup that we're having at Data Council Austin that day as well, in the afternoon at 12:15, I believe, on the lunch break. So if you're already planning to be there, or if you're in the Austin area, it'd be great to see you. Can join the meetup and meet your fellow contributors in person and have a say in potentially what we do in the project going forward. So that's all happening a week from today. Also next week, March 28th through 30th, no fewer than 3 of our contributors will be speaking at Big Data Tech Warsaw. It's a hybrid event this year. Ross, Pavel, and Maciej will be presenting. Pavel and Maciej will be doing a joint presentation touching on column lineage, Spark, and OpenLineage, I believe. And Ross, I believe, will be giving a more general talk about the OpenLineage spec. So a lot to look forward to next week. Is there anything else that you'd like to share that we don't have on the slide? So moving on quickly to the recent release, and I won't read all the release notes to you. That's what the release notes are for. And there's some links here on the bottom for your convenience. But 0.32.0 looks like a small release, but there were some big improvements here. In the API, for example, we have an improved SQL query for a performance benefit. And in the Helm chart, an important fix there, the UI is operational again. There was a breakdown in communication due to a misassigned port. And the UI is rendering completely now, thanks to a fix there, because when the SQL job facet was null, there were a couple of pages that weren't rendering. Some key removals as well. I'll just talk about one of them. We no longer have a job context. This was a change. It's been in the works since November of last year. And we've done away with job context, and now information about jobs and runs are coming directly from facets. So this meant a big reduction in the amount of code in the project, for one thing. Mike Collado is going to tell us about another removal and change in just a minute. But before we turn to him, let me thank all our contributors for their contributions and welcome Thomas Del Rue to the project. Thank you, Thomas, for that key Helm chart fix this month. So thanks to everybody. So let me turn it over to Mike.
Yeah, okay. So I think it was almost exactly a year ago that we added the concept of FQNs, fully qualified names, to jobs, and added the ability for a job to have a parent job. The idea being that, so when a scheduler or workflow orchestrator such as Airflow kicks off a job, you want to kind of qualify that job instance by the scheduler to say that, okay, this job is kicked off by this parent. So you could have maybe a US version of the job and an EU version of the job and South America version of the job or something like along those lines, right? And then so one of the things that we did, so in the original Marquez database schema, there is a uniqueness requirement around job names, and we wanted to keep that uniqueness requirement, but it was important for a job to have, right, if the two versions of the job had different parents, they would have different FQNs. And so we changed the uniqueness to constraint to consider both the name of the job and its parent. Now, one of the downsides that we ended up seeing was in some cases in OpenLineage, the parent information is omitted from the OpenLineage event. So specifically when jobs fail, they will report OpenLineage information without the parent facet. And usually this is not a big deal because as long as we get the start event for a job, that does include the facet information, or the parent facet, and so we can define the parent of the job based on that start event, and then when the failure event comes, it has the same run ID, so we know it's the same job, and so we can just kind of say, okay, this failure event belongs to this specific run and has this specific parent. However, in a lot of cases, for various reasons, Airflow and other integrations will only send a failure event, and sometimes the failure happens before the start event actually gets triggered. And so in those cases, we would get a failure event without a parent, and it would try to define a new job. But ultimately, that job still had the same fully qualified name as the job that does have a parent. And so we ended up running into these cases where frequently we would see two jobs that had the same fully qualified name. And then when you try to retrieve that job through the API based on its name, you would throw an exception because there were two jobs coming back rather than a single job. We tried a bunch of different strategies to addressing that on the Marquez side, but unfortunately, right, the issue just kind of kept cropping up. And so basically this fix was to just change the way that constraint was handled, and add specific handling for these cases when we know that we're getting job information that is missing parent facets, and we can update an existing job to include its parent facet information if that parent information comes later on. So the goal is basically just to eliminate that duplication and eliminate those exceptions, so we have that uniqueness constraint again on job names. So I don't know if how many people were running into this issue. I've never seen it come up in the Marquez Slack, but I know here at Astronomer, we saw it happening quite frequently. And again, it would crop up every couple of months or so. So hopefully we've killed this bug once and for all. So that's effectively it.
Cool. Thank you very much. Any questions for Mike?
But I think the only thing I would point out is, Mike, the jobs FQN table is going to go away, right? So
right.
If for any reason someone was querying that table or was leveraging it for something internal, I think it's important to communicate that that table eventually will be dropped.
Oh, yes. And good call out, Willy. The table still exists and is actually still being written to. And that is just because, we have a philosophy on making backwards incompatible changes to our database schema. So we will change the code first to stop using a table. And then at a later release, we will actually drop the table. But this way, if we push out a new version of Marquez and for some reason we have to roll back, right? Like there might be a bug in the code or something like that, we can roll back and that table still exists and is still compatible with the older version of Marquez. But so for the time being, the table exists. It is being updated all the time. And so, but it is going to be dropped eventually.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Mike. Let's see here if I can share again and move on to the next. So as I mentioned, we have two discussion topics on the agenda today. Let's start with one from Bruno. And I'll just let you start us off, Bruno, with your discussion topic.
Well, well, thank you first, and thank you for all of you to accept me in the community. Because I'm kind of outsider, and well, for two reasons. One is because I come from BI world, as I said already. Second, because I'm not really anymore a programmer. Anyway, in order to coherently to be coherent with your approaches, I would like first to know a little bit more of you. And so what I will start with questions more than most of all. And the first question, if everybody here around the table give his tiny seeds on what it means to him, open lineage and business intelligence. Would you, who's the, who want to answer?
Is it sort of how do we define open lineage? And I say, so what's...
Yes, everybody, I would like to understand what is for you when you think about open lineage and the BI, what you think about it, in which terms you consider these two concepts together.
So I think like OpenLineage wants to capture the lineage end to end, you know, from the ETL to transformations, warehouse, and the BI tools. So currently, a BI dashboard is not yet modeled in the OpenLineage model. We also have been working on a more static lineage definition in OpenLineage. So there's a document that is being shared, and actually we're going to talk about it at the meetup next week at Data Console as well. And which is because OpenLineage started with capturing lineage, operational lineage, and capturing every run of the transformation. And there are instances where we have more static lineage as well. For example, a logical view or a BI dashboard could be that as well, where you define this lineage, probably not every query, but more as in this dashboard depends on those tables. So yes, it's a goal to have this, and it's part of the spec. And the second part is it's currently being worked on. And OpenLineage first focused on the transformations part in between, like a SQL query, a Spark job, DPT job. And now we started working on how do we model things that are a bit more static as well in the model.
Thank you, Julien.
You're welcome.
Other contributor? Is there some other people that some other person that could add other elements?
I think Sherry, so Sherry is not here today, but she has a lot of opinions about this. And there's been a channel on the OpenLineage Slack where this kind of thing has been discussed, and you find that over there, I think.
Yeah, no, I did have something to add, but I want to make sure others chime in if they would like. Okay, so briefly for me, so on top of what Julien mentioned, I think I would just like to add, you know, with BI, a lot of the time you define your key business metrics. So, you know, how do you grow your company? There are key things that you look at to know if you're doing well. And that all, if you look at where that data is coming from, you're going to have to connect it somehow through lineage. So if you start seeing maybe churn, right, on your product, is that because there's some issue with maybe your pipeline, or maybe there's a feature that you pushed out recently that customers just don't like? So being able to look at your BI tool and say, wait, there is something weird going on, and answering that is a very important thing, which is very hard at the moment to solve. And which is why the BI facet for OpenLineage was being discussed. I think now, Julien, was it over a year ago or maybe more? And we do believe that's such an important part of the standard. It's just how do you begin to introduce a facet that can can meet the needs for BI tools like there's a bunch of BI, I'm not going to list them, but yeah, there's a bunch out there. So each one could be specific, they could be more generic, but it just hasn't been talked about deeply enough. So that's just my 2 cents on that. You know, in the end, all the work that we're doing as data engineers comes down to making data available for analysts, and if that data is not correct or they lose confidence, then there's a huge issue there. So how do you build that back, and hopefully being able to trace back where the source of the problem was?
And yeah,
Any
and
other contributor?
yeah,
Sorry.
Bruno, I
Sorry.
mean, as I mentioned to you in our conversation, I think it was last week, I really don't know enough about BI tools. I mean, we've talked in the OpenLineage community about the importance of personas and kind of expanding our thought around that. But as far as BI tools specifically, I'm kind of not qualified to opine.
Yeah, I'll just say
Well,
sorry, Bruno.
please. So, no, please, come on.
Yeah, I was just say I think my definition of BI is maybe even too broad, and I'm also thinking about, you know, how do things like machine learning models come into play here, and are we going to be looking at like the kind of registries that MLOps people build out to push their models to, and like how do they have like feature catalogs and feature stores that they want represented with Lineage as well? And so I think that's maybe in some ways not the traditional like BI tool there, but I think one more avenue to think about how OpenLineage can engage with a lot of different tools.
And it's interesting what you and Julien said. And there is a sort of relationship between the two answers. So Julien, from what I interpreted, you look BI mainly as the act of generating the visuals. Is it?
So I'm looking at what mainly the dependency from the BI thing. So the way I was looking at it is you define dashboards, right? And they depend on data sets. They depend on tables or something, right? So capturing that dependency and be able to model that. So you can start from a dashboard and you know what table is reading from, you know who produces those tables all the way to where ETL is getting the data.
Well, exactly. So my understanding was the good one. So it turns out that even when there is an exceptionally good data model, BI tool do a lot more than just given the restitution. And so the first part, for example, if everything is fine in the database, is just getting the data and doing some aggregations, okay? So that's the easy part. That's the ideal situation where in the lineage, you just have those aggregation steps to add, and eventually, from the visualization point of view, then just document where the KPI is used within a chart, a table, or whatever. But it turns out that this is not always the case. And most of the time, there is a less where the database as a first level of transformation, and the BI tool, which most of the BI tool contains a sort of internal ETL language. They do load the data, they aggregate different tables, and they generate internally their own data model. So this is the first step on going to less industrialized, but when I say that, less best practice way of working. But this is often, quite often, the situation. And what the second contributor added is a third step, because when you put in the loop the machine learning, well, it's totally not industrialized, meaning that there are people that go reading the database tables as a source, so they get the feature and from the database table, and then in non-industrialized tools, so quite often notebooks, they start training a model. And ideally, what should be done would be to reinject the output of the model on the tables of the data model itself in the database. But this only happens for a few situations. What quite often it happens is that, as said before, it comes as a BI clone system in the company, where instead of using the standard BI tool, there are dashboarding that are generated by the machine learning tools and the machine learning teams. And so it's totally another lineage with really few data that goes back to the database, to the central database. So that those are 3 degrees of lack of best practice and in the companies when handling data for BI and machine learning. And so this is what makes the goal of integrating the BI in OpenLineage the most difficult, because on the paper we can create a system that works because we just consider BI as what it should be, a restitution system, whereas BI is not, unfortunately, only that. So that ends my my contribution for today, where I wanted to highlight the pros and cons and how best practice and industrialization do not marry, do not work on the same direction in the BI. If I made myself clear, sorry with this last sentence.
So I think
okay, is it okay?
One of the things that
please.
Yeah, sorry, there's some latency on the call. One of the things that the OpenLineage spec does is capturing the transformations, right? Like, so knowing that there's a data set in input and there's some transformation, can be SQL, can be something else, and that transform into other data set. So if in the internals of a BI tool, there's a transformation layer and there's some intermediate representation that is then used to serve dashboard, for example, I think there's lots of flexibility to model that appropriately, and even like on a case-by-case basis. Not all BI tools need to represent that layer the same way, but it seems to me that there's a way to make it fit the current model.
Yes, I do think so. And to be transparent, I'm working on expanding a library that exists on GitHub to have click view data loaded into Python. And then if we would manage to do that, then it would be a first starting step to add a BI tool as a source for OpenLineage.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah. Well, thank you. I think we should probably move on to our next discussion topic, and that's Willy's implication of design/static lineage.
Thank you, Bruno.
Yeah, thank you, Bruno.
Well, thanks to
I think did we lose it? But either way, Bruno, I'm excited to see where developments go with that, with the tool that you're talking about, and adding OpenLineage to the tool. But speaking of OpenLineage, I'm actually glad Julian's also on the call here. Let me share my screen. Okay. All right, I think everyone should be seeing my screen. I just wanted to make this aware to the community, or this design doc. It's been authored by Mache, who has been a big contributor to Marquez, but is now focusing on OpenLineage. And Julian, one of the contributors with Benji, who's on the call. But the main idea here is that we have multiple use cases for Marquez. If I go back to when we were originally developing Marquez at WeWork, we did have APIs that allowed you to register data sets and also register job metadata outside the context of a run. And if I go to the API, you can kind of see that. If I go data sets here, see how we've deprecated to create a data set. The big change here was to move towards completely adopting OpenLineage as a way to collect lineage metadata, and that includes the data sets and also the jobs that were within the context of a run. But that run metadata is really one lineage view. We call it run level. We call it a run level lineage graph. There is now the need to define OpenLineage standard as maybe V2, or sort of maybe extending it to support defining data sets and jobs outside the context of a run. So that's where we have more static lineage, or really how would Marquez begin to define lineage outside the context of a run? Because that run ID is really important for us to version metadata. So if we go here, the run itself is probably the most critical part of how Marquez manages its versioning. So we know the input and output dataset versions that are associated with a run. We also know the job version that that run, or in this case, used to produce output datasets. So you're able to track that, and it's really core to how Marquez applies versioning, the versioning function. What this would mean if we begin to discuss static lineage is really you remove job version away, you remove the run, and also the dataset version. So really you're just left with a relationship between dataset and job, and no version associated with that. So there are implications to that model, but they should be viewed differently. I think there's strong use cases for both. One use case that we see in what we were building at WeWork was just scraping databases. So if you have data sets, or in this case tables in Snowflake, you can go out and just have some cron or some scraper that says, give me the table information and let me post that to the Marquez backend. Before we were using the REST API, now it would be the lineage event. Oops. There we go. So just for some context there, I do want to point out the objectives real quick. Dataset that submit from OpenLineage is absent of a run event, and that's kind of what I elaborated on. It's outside the context of a run, and really what's contained within that event itself. Do we define dataset event, job events, and here you could see we also want to capture the job metadata as well. So that would include the facets that we have now, with source location and other metadata that you'd like to attach. And this is the more critical part for us. And when for Marquez, we are a consumer of OpenLineage events. So what are the implications, and how do we manage processing different events that no longer have the run ID? And the doc does go into the use cases as well, which happy to go into, but I just want to make sure that we go to the proposed model. Let's see, extensions. And there's some discussions happening here, but I want to go back. I want to go just so others can see what this would look like. We would still use JSON schema, so that doesn't change. Here you would have a dataset event, and you would have the schema. I'm sorry, no, not the schema here. Where's the dataset itself, which represents a dataset, and that would have the schema and other facets that we would attach. And then same thing for a job. You'd have a job event, and inside there you'd contain the job metadata. The more interesting thing for me on the consumer side is how would then, so with the job event itself, you would have to have the inputs and outputs. Marquez would have to know what inputs and outputs should be associated with the job. So they'll be predefined, and then we can build that lineage graph. But there needs to be this other level of lineage where we're not using run level metadata. So there's two jobs themselves. In terms of maybe I'll just stop there. Julian, yeah, I'm not going to go too deep in this, but Julian, I'm sure I missed some things, but this is just me.
I had a question. I had a comment. Can you go back to your original Marquez model diagram? Right.
This one here.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say, in my opinion, there's still job versions and dataset versions, right? Like the only thing that is not touched in this graph is the run, right? And if we look at this, I wonder, I think I can annotate on your screen and just show something. Maybe not. Oh, that's fine. Oh yeah, here it is. Right, so we have two level of graph in here. Right here, this is the run level lineage, right? It keeps track of a job version, a run for a given job version, right, from a dataset enrolled to a dataset. So it keeps a run level lineage, right? So that's what we've been doing with, there's a query running, that particular instance of the query, read this version of the dataset, enrolled that version of the dataset, and you can keep track of the schema of the dataset change and so on. Now, if I clear, the other graph we have is the static graph, right? Like, which is like the current, usually it is inferred from the run level graph, right? We keep track of a given job is in this current version is reading from a dataset and writing to a dataset. So in the case of static lineage, we would update this layer, right? So if I clear, you would still have this information being updated. And in particular, because when you update a new static facet for a dataset, for example, you may change the schema, so you get a new dataset version. You still know what schema it was before. And for a job version, let's say we have a job and we know that the lineage for that job has changed. Now it's reading from a new table. It would still update its version, and we know that this job is reading from this. Right?
Yeah, I agree with that, Julian. It's just that's not current. It's not how it works anymore. The job versions are only created when a job successfully completes or fails. So we ended up introducing these temp inputs and outputs. So when you have an instance of a run and it completes and finishes, that's when job versions are created. What this ends up doing, or if we want to keep job versions around as the metadata changes, it goes back to the original logic that we had before. So anytime inputs and outputs change or the job location changes, you now have versions.
Yeah, but see, and I kind of wanted to mention this when you were talking about the changes to like that job event, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think you can have job versions and especially explicitly defined job versions without like, and kind of decoupling that logic about, defining a job version based on its inputs and outputs. For example, right, like one of the things that I would really love to see would be like a CI or CD integration where you publish a new version of your code, you deploy to production, and it just reports the job version information, right? Like rather than having to have access to, for example, like the Git SHA or something like that at runtime, to say like this is the version of the code, right? Like why not just deploy, like why not just report that at deployment time? And then if you have that integration, right, maybe your CI or your CD pipeline doesn't actually have information to what the inputs and outputs of that job are, right? And so why burden the CD pipeline with that information when really the only thing it needs to know is what's the version of the code that's being deployed? And so if you can report that information, and then when the job runs, you can actually see its inputs and outputs. At that point, you can just say, hey, I know that this is the running version of the code. And here are the inputs and the outputs. And I feel like it's kind of similar to the dataset version stuff that we talked about with Ryan Hatter some time ago, right? If the database itself tells you this is the version ID, right? Like for example, if you're using Iceberg or something where there are version numbers or version identifiers for a data set, like just use the identifier that's reported to you by the database, or use the version information that's reported to you by the job deployment pipeline. And then you can augment it with information like the inputs and the outputs. And in many cases, right, maybe you don't have that explicitly defined version, and then you can fall back on, oh, the schema changed, so we're going to change the version, or we know that a write happens to this data set, so we're going to like come up with a new data set version, or the job information changed, so we're going to come up with a new version information. But if it's explicitly defined, use the explicitly defined version, and then otherwise you can kind of fall back.
I agree. Oh, yeah, I think it's proposal. But so yeah, I do remember this conversation that we had with Ryan, right? So there's also going to be two modes of Marquez, or that's what we discussed here, where you can explicitly provide the version, and Marquez will use that, versus implicit. So a lot of what in the design of the versioning, we just wanted to remove the bottleneck, or it's just like that hurdle to start versioning metadata, and Marquez has its own implementation behind the scenes, but we should make it explicit. We should define a Marquez facet, or if we want this to be part of the core OpenLineage, it's like, hey, here's a job version ID that you should be using, and then same thing for data sets. And once Marquez knows that, oh wait, this is now being managed external, it will begin to look at that facet to say, oh, has the version changed, rather than more of an implicit versioning logic, which this proposal goes into a little bit. But yeah, there's definitely some discussion that needs to be had there. I'm glad that you brought that up, Mike. I think that's really important. Yeah, it's the follow-up I had on it. But yeah, I just want to bring that to everyone's attention. I kind of lost where the doc is. Here it is. Highly recommend, for those that want to leave feedback, the discussion is pretty active, and it's worth giving a review on seeing where the standard might go. This does have implications for Marquez, and also consumers in general, and how, whether we manage backwards compatibility or we just do a clean break from the standard. There's a lot of pros and cons there, but now's a good time to give that feedback. I know, Julian, there's no set date exactly for when we want feedback in, but the sooner the better. That's really.
I think, yeah, so we're going to get some more feedback at the meetup next week, and I think we want to accelerate a bit the discussion. So I had added some other use cases in there, but I think we decided we'll move it to a separate document, because it's like it's engine spec, but it's not. So the part that is in suggestion, I put in suggestion in the doc, I'll move it to a different doc to not pollute that conversation.
Okay.
personally, I would want to get this moving relatively soon.
Hmm.
We can
Yeah.
say months or something.
Okay, great. Yeah, the doc is free, or I'm not. I mean, it's anyone can access it and anyone can leave comments. So I did post it in the channel, the Zoom chat, but I'll also post this in the Slack channel after this meeting. So, sure.
All right. Anything further? Thanks for the great discussion. Thanks for coming today. Looking forward to seeing folks next month, and hope you enjoy the meetup next week.
Awesome.
Looking
Cool.
forward to it. Thank you, Willy.
Okay,
Bye.
folks.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.